At 52 years old, Cora Willett had nothing left of her name but a satchel of mending tools and clothes on her back, cast out of her sister's home in Millhaven Creek, when her brother-in-law decided a widowed woman past 50 was one mouth too many to feed. All she carried was $6, the sum total of a lifetime's careful saving, and when she saw the old Icehouse standing rotted and forgotten at the edge of the frozen mill pond, its timbers black with mildew, and its door hanging loose on one hinge, she paid every last cent of it at a forgotten property auction nobody else bothered to attend. The men who witnessed the sale called it the saddest purchase they'd seen in years, a worthless shell no sound person would want. They did not know that beneath the packed sawdust and ancient ice still lodged in its floor lay something that would leave the whole town speechless within the year. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Cora Willett. If you've ever been told you were too much of a burden to keep around, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Cora had been born Cora in Fenwick in 1836 on a modest farmstead outside Millhaven Creek, Minnesota, back when the town was little more than a mill, a chapel, and a scattering of cabins pressed close against the tree line for shelter from the winters that came down hard and early off the northern plains. Her father, Silas Fenwick, ran the Icehouse that would decades later become her only shelter. Cutting blocks in the mill pond each January with a crew of local men and packing them in sawdust deep enough to keep the whole town in cold storage clear through August. And it was from him that Cora learned the particular, patient craft of preservation, how to judge ice thickness by the sound of saw made cutting into it, how to layer sawdust so no air pocket could rot a block from within, how patience and careful stacking could make something as fragile as frozen water outlast the very season that made it. Her mother, Agnes, was known throughout the county for her needlework, and it was from her that Cora learned to mend torn cloth so finely the tear seemed never to have existed at all, a skill she would lean on hard in the years still to come. The Fenwick household was not wealthy, but Cora grew up believing, in the quiet, unspoken way children absorb such things from watching their parents, that a thing cared for properly, whether ice or fabric or a person's good name, could be made to last far longer than anyone expected. It was her father who taught her the Icehouse's deepest secret, though she did not understand its full weight until many years later. Silas Fenwick was a deeply private man about money, having grown up poor himself and watched two separate bank failures wipe out neighboring families in his youth, and he trusted paper currency in distant vaults far less than he trusted what he could see with his own eyes and bury with his own hands. Cora remembered, as a girl perhaps 10, helping her father one bitter January night long after the cutting crew had gone home, watching him work alone by lantern light at the Icehouse's rear wall, though she had been too young and too sleepy to understand what he was doing there, and he had sworn her to silence about the whole affair with a seriousness that frightened her a little, telling her only that a wise person kept something set aside where no bank panic and no thieving relation could ever reach it. She had promised, as children promise such things, more out of love for her father than any real comprehension, and the memory had settled into some quiet, half-forgotten corner of her mind for over 40 years, the way childhood confidences often do. Cora married at 22 to a kind, unassuming trapper and part-time carpenter named Amos Willett, and the two of them lived a modest, contented life on a small parcel near the edge of town, Cora taking and mending work from half the families in Millhaven Creek, while Amos worked the trap lines each winter and built furniture and cabinetry the rest of the year. They had no children, a sorrow the two of them carried quietly and without complaint, and instead poured their care into each other and into the small, steady rhythms of their life together,
come right on
rhythms
in.
that felt,
Thank you
in
so
the
much,
moment,
man. We've been
like
on the
they might
trail
simply
a long
continue
time.
indefinitely.
We have plenty of
Cora's
room.
father
Please
died
don't
when she was 30,
hesitate.
We're
her mother
truly
following
grateful.
4 years
Let's
later.
get you warm.
The old family Icehouse no longer needed once the newer, larger cooperative Icehouse went up near the rail depot, was left to Cora as the only surviving Fenwick child, though she had neither the funds nor the pressing need to maintain it, and it stood empty and untouched, its purpose quietly forgotten by a town that had moved on to easier means of keeping cold. The fall that stripped Cora of everything began slowly, the way most true disasters do, arriving first as a series of small misfortunes that seemed individually survivable. Amos Willett died in the winter of 1885, caught in an early blizzard while checking his trap lines, and though his death left Cora devastated, it did not at first leave her destitute. For the small house they shared was paid free, and Clear and Amos had left behind a modest but real inheritance in careful savings. The trouble came the following year, when Cora's younger sister Delphine, recently remarried to a hard, calculating man named Reuben Ashworth, began pressing Cora to move in with them, framing it as familial concern for a lonely widow, but meaning, as Cora slowly came to understand, control over whatever remained of Cora's small estate. Reuben Ashworth was a man perpetually chasing one scheme or another, a failed dry goods venture here, a poorly timed land speculation there. And he saw in his sister-in-law's modest nest egg an opportunity too convenient to pass by, convincing the grieving and still vulnerable Cora, within her first year of widowhood, to sign her small house and savings over to him as collateral against what he promised would be a brief, lucrative business venture that would benefit them all. The venture failed, as Reuben's ventures reliably did. And within 18 months, Cora found herself not merely without her house and savings, but actively blamed by her own sister for a decision Reuben had engineered and Cora had only reluctantly, trustingly agreed to. She moved into the small back room of Delphine and Reuben's house, taking in what mending work she could contribute something toward her keep, enduring 3 years an arrangement that grew colder and more resentful with each passing season, Reuben's failed schemes multiplying and his temper souring alongside them, until finally, in the autumn of Cora's 52nd year, he declared at supper one evening that the household could no longer support a woman who did not properly belong to it, that Millhaven Creek surely had a poorhouse or a charitable ward willing to take her in, and that she had until week's end to make other arrangements. Delphine, to her lasting shame, though she would not fully reckon with it for some time, said nothing in Cora's defense, and so on a cold morning in late October, Cora Willett left the only shelter available to her, with $6 sewn into her coat lining, every cent she had managed to earn and hide from mending work Reuben did not know about, and walked into Millhaven Creek proper with no clear notion of what came next. It was outside the county clerk's office, where she had gone hoping vainly for word of any charitable relief, that Cora heard the small, unenthusiastic crowd gather for a forgotten property auction, parcels seized for unpaid taxes and abandoned structures nobody wanted, being sold off cheaply to clear the county's books before winter. Among the listed items, described with almost dismissive brevity, was Icehouse, disused, Fenwick property, Mill Pond Road, and hearing her own maiden name spoken aloud in that dull auctioneer's drone struck Cora with a force that nearly buckled her knees. She had, in the chaos and grief of preceding years, entirely forgotten that the old family Icehouse, left to her decades earlier and never properly transferred or claimed by Reuben in his acquisitive sweep of her affairs simply because he hadn't known it existed, remained technically hers, sitting forgotten and untaxed for at the edge of the mill pond where her father had once cut ice by lantern light. When the auctioneer, more out of procedure than expectation, asked whether the county might simply confirm the existing but lapsed Fenwick claim for the price of back taxes owed, a sum that came, astonishingly, to exactly $6, Cora heard herself answer before she had fully decided to speak, and within minutes she owned, once again, the rotting ice house of her childhood, a structure the gathered crowd openly agreed was worth nothing at all. She walked a mile out to the mill pond that same afternoon, her last coin now spent entirely, and stood before the ice house for a long moment before summoning the courage to force open its swollen door. Inside she found exactly what 4 decades of neglect leaves behind. Collapsed shelving, moldering sawdust gone black and sour with damp. At the floor center, astonishingly, a stubborn core of ancient ice that had somehow survived compacted beneath layer upon layer of insulating sawdust for years beyond any reasonable expectation, kept just barely below freezing by the ice house's deep earthen walls and the persistent cold that gathered at the pond's edge. Cora stood over that strange, impossible remnant of ice with a growing, prickling unease, some old memory stirring faintly at the edges of her mind, a lantern-lit January night from 40 years past that she had not thought of in decades, her father's careful, private hands working at something near the rear wall, while he swore her to silence with unusual gravity. She spent that first night huddled in the driest corner she could find, wrapped in her coat, and the days that followed she did what a lifetime of careful mending had trained her to do, which was to work patiently and methodically at restoring order to a ruined thing, clearing rotted sawdust, shoring up a collapsing shelf, trading small mending jobs in town for nails and tallow, while telling curious neighbors only that she meant to make the old family property livable again. It was on the 4th day, clearing sawdust from the rear wall her father had always favored for the finest cuts. That Cora's shovel struck something that was not ice and was not packed earth, and working with trembling hands and a growing certainty she could not fully explain, she uncovered, buried beneath the ancient ice core at a depth that suggested it had been placed there and then deliberately frozen over decades earlier, a small iron strongbox, its surface pitted with rust but its seams, still sound enough to have kept its contents dry through 40 winters. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a bent nail and sheer stubbornness in the fading afternoon light, to force the strongbox open, and what she found inside made her sit back hard against the Icehouse's cold earthen wall, the memory of that long-ago lantern-lit night suddenly clicking into full, startling clarity. There was money, not a vast fortune, but a substantial sum for a woman who had spent 3 years counting every penny, gold coin totaling just over $300, and beneath the coin, wrapped carefully in oilcloth that had kept it remarkably preserved, a bundle of documents in her father's own careful hand, along with a second, older set of papers written by a hand she did not recognize at all, cramped and hurried where her father's was neat and deliberate. Reading by the last of the daylight through the Icehouse's broken door, Cora pieced together, with mounting astonishment, a story her father had apparently carried to his grave without ever telling a living soul beyond the silent, half-remembered promise he had extracted from a 10-year-old girl decades before. The older papers, dated 1849, belonged to a man named Josiah Kettering, one of Millhaven Creek's earliest settlers, a would-be entrepreneur who had, according to his own frantic account, uncovered evidence during a land survey dispute that the county's original founding charter, the document establishing the boundaries and water rights of the entire township, had been deliberately falsified by a small group of early landholders to exclude several parcels of good farmland and water access from the public commons and quietly funnel them into their own private holdings, a fraud so foundational to the town's earliest years that unwinding it, even decades later, would have thrown half of Millhaven Creek's established land titles into legal chaos. Kettering, it seemed, had gathered proof of this original fraud, the true, unaltered survey markers and witness testimonies contradicting the official filed charter, but before he could bring the matter before proper authorities, he had fallen gravely ill in the winter of 1849 and, sensing he would not survive, had entrusted the evidence to the one man in town he considered incorruptible, Cora's grandfather, old Ezekiel Fenwick, the Icehouse's original builder, along with instructions that the truth should be revealed only if and when it could restore rightful water and land access to families still being quietly squeezed by the fraud's lingering effects, rather than simply reopening old wounds for their own sake. Ezekiel Fenwick, according to a note in his own hand appended to Kettering's original papers, had judged that revealing the fraud immediately would ruin not just the original conspirators, but their innocent children and grandchildren who had built honest lives atop land titles they had no idea were compromised, and so he had made the difficult choice to preserve the evidence rather than destroy or immediately expose it, sealing it beneath the Icehouse floor with instructions passed only to his son, Cora's father Silas, to watch for a time when revealing the truth might actually help living people rather than merely punish the long dead. Silas, in his own additional notes dated some years later, recorded that he had continued watching for such a moment throughout his own life, but had never found circumstances that seemed to justify the disruption, and had eventually, feeling his own health failing, simply passed the unspoken burden down through silence and a single childhood promise, perhaps hoping, Cora thought with sting of something between grief and wonder, that the right moment and the right person might someday find it. On their own, Cora sat with those papers until well after dark, understanding now the strange gravity of that long-ago lantern-lit January night, understanding that her family had quietly guarded a town's founding secret for nearly 40 years out of a scrupulousness that bordered on the sacred, and understanding, with clarity that settled cold and certain into her chest, that Millhaven Creek in the present day was still very much shaped by that original fraud, for the same handful of founding families, whose ancestors had stolen the disputed land and water rights still held disproportionate control over the town's best farmland and, crucially, its water access along the very mill pond where she now sat, control that had, in recent years, allowed them to charge steep fees for pond access to farmers whose own ancestors had been quietly cheated out of free and equal rights to that same water generations earlier. She thought of her own 3 years under Reuben Ashworth's grudging roof, of every family in town straining under water fees that need never have existed at all had a founding wrong been righted before it calcified into simple, unquestioned custom. And she understood that her father and grandfather's long, careful patience had, perhaps without either of them intending it, been waiting for exactly this moment, when someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from justice might finally be the one to carry the truth forward. She moved carefully rather than rashly, spending the following weeks quietly restoring the Icehouse to livable condition, while she also, with the same patient thoroughness her mending work had trained into her, began researching the town's earliest land records at the county courthouse, comparing Kettering's preserved survey markers against the currently filed charter documents, and speaking in careful, unhurried conversations with a handful of elderly Millhaven Creek residents whose families had farmed the disputed parcels for generations without ever suspecting the true history behind their limited water access. What she found confirmed every claim in Kettering's original papers. The discrepancies between the true survey lines and the officially filed charter unmistakable once she knew precisely where to look, and she learned in the process that the modern-day beneficiary of that original fraud, the man who now controlled the mill pond's water rights and charged the town's farmers dearly for the privilege of access, was Harlan Voss, a prosperous descendant of one of the original conspiring families. And, in a bitter irony Cora could not help but notice, the very man who currently held a mortgage on her own late husband's house, the house Reuben Ashworth had signed away in his failed venture. It did not take long for Harlan Voss to learn that the widow Willett was quietly asking pointed questions about old land surveys and water rights, and his response, when it came, was neither subtle nor patient. He rode out to the Icehouse himself one gray November afternoon, finding Cora at work clearing debris from what would soon become a modest but livable single room, and offered her, without preamble, $15 for the Icehouse property outright, a sum that would solve her immediate hardship entirely, and that a more desperate woman might well have accepted gladly. When Cora calmly declined, Voss's polished manner thinned quickly into something harder, and he informed her, with a flat certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that the mill pond's water access belonged entirely to the cooperative he controlled regardless of who owned the surrounding land, that her little Icehouse would never again draw water from that pond as it once had, and that a woman alone with no standing and no family willing to claim her would do well to abandon whatever foolish notions she was entertaining about the town's old history before those notions cost her the small shelter she had. Cora recognized in his tone the same controlling certainty she had endured for 3 years under Reuben's roof, and something in her, some quiet steel her father's patience and her mother's careful needlework had both, in their different ways, instilled in her, simply refused to bend. The weeks that followed brought the particular, grinding pressure a small town can bring to bear on someone as decided to distrust. Voss, sensing correctly that Cora's questions threatened something he could not yet fully name, began quietly suggesting to shopkeepers and neighbors that the widow Willett had grown strange and unreliable in her grief, prone to wild claims about ancient conspiracies, a story that gained some traction among those who barely knew her, and none at all among the families who had grown to respect her careful, patient mending work over the years. Cora, for her part, continued her methodical documentation, securing sworn statements from elderly residents who remembered fragments of old family stories about the founding charter's irregularities, verifying Kettering's original survey markers against physical boundary stones still standing half-forgotten at the edges of several disputed properties, and enlisting the cautious but ultimately persuaded help of the young deputy county clerk, a careful, thorough man named Elias Thorne who, upon reviewing her evidence, found himself unable to dismiss discrepancies that plainly should not have existed in a properly filed charter. The reckoning came that December, at a town meeting called to discuss, ironically enough, a proposed increase in pond access fees that Voss's cooperative intended to impose ahead of the coming ice-cutting season. Cora arrived with Kettering's preserved papers, her father's and grandfather's accompanying notes, and Elias Thorne's own careful comparison of the true survey lines against the filed charter, and when the floor opened for public comment, she stood and asked, in a voice made steady by 4 decades of patient waiting she had not even known she was carrying, to be heard on a matter concerning every family present. She laid out, plainly and without embellishment, the story of a founding fraud nearly 40 years buried, Red Kettering's original testimony and her family's careful stewardship of it across 3 generations, and showed the assembled town the physical proof of survey lines that did not match the charter Voss's forebears had relied upon for 2 generations of quiet advantage. Voss protested loudly at first, then with increasing desperation. But when Elias Thorne confirmed for the gathered crowd that the discrepancies were both real and verifiable, the room fell into a silence more complete than any Cora had ever witnessed. The whole town, in that moment, quietly reckoning with a truth that had been sitting frozen and forgotten beneath an old woman's ice house for longer than most of them had been alive. The justice that followed unfolded gradually but firmly. The county, faced with verified evidence of an original charter fraud, moved to restore proper water and boundary rights according to the true historical survey, a process that stripped Voss's cooperative of its exclusive control over the mill pond and returned free equal access to the farming families whose ancestors had been quietly cheated of it generations before. Voss himself, his family's long-standing advantage suddenly and publicly undone, found his standing in Millhaven Creek collapse within a single season, his mortgage holdings, including the note on Cora's late husband's house, sold off to cover mounting debts as farmers who had once quietly paid his fees now had no reason to do business with him at all. Cora, offered the chance to reclaim her old house through the very upheaval her discovery had caused, chose instead to use a portion of her father's preserved coin to help the town establish the Icehouse itself, restored and expanded as a genuine cooperative resource once more. Free ice storage available to any family in Millhaven Creek, regardless of what they could afford to pay. Precisely the kind of shared, equal provision her grandfather had first envisioned decades before political fear had led him to bury the whole truth rather than risk its consequences. It is worth remembering now how this story began, with a 52-year-old widow standing outside a rotted, forgotten ice house with $6 to her name and nowhere else in the world willing to have her. Millhaven Creek had looked at Cora Willett in those early weeks and seen only an unwanted, aging widow, a burden passed unhappily from one reluctant household to nowhere at all, and they had looked at the old Fenwick ice house and seen only a worthless ruin, fit for nothing but eventual collapse into the mill pond it once served. Both judgments mistook age and stillness for emptiness, mistook what had been quietly set aside for what held no value at all. What waited beneath that ancient, impossible ice was never merely coin, though the coin mattered greatly to a woman who had counted every penny for years. What waited there was 3 generations of careful, anxious stewardship, a truth too dangerous to reveal carelessly and too important to destroy, entrusted finally to the one Fenwick left standing who had nothing left to lose and, therefore, nothing left to fear in finally setting it free. Cora Willett, cast out and unwanted, became the one who carried her family's frozen patience the final mile of its long journey, and in doing so she gave her hometown back something far more valuable than water rights alone. Proof that some truths, however long buried, wait only for the right hands to finally receive them. Thank you for spending this time with Cora's story and with all of ours here tonight. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need the reminder that being set aside by the people closest to you is never the same as being without worth. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that the people around you had already given up on? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.